Hi, Frank. Welcome to the CXO podcast. In this series, we actually talk about future focused CXOs like yourself, and I'm very glad to welcome you. A quick introduction about you, and I hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to be here today. So Frank Pinder, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Corporate Visions. I'm really focused on digital sales transformation. So that's in my job title, and that's my core kind of mission and mandate is to go after the market of companies that are going through this big transformation as a result of lots of different things. I'm also an advisor to the AISP and to Vidyard, and then previously in the past at SalesLoft. I've tried to stay very connected in with the up and coming sales technology companies over the last several years, and then thinking more broadly about how that's unfolding in our market and how these things are all coming together from a digital selling perspective, which you'll hear me refer to many times throughout the day to day. Some people call it inside sales, some people call it digital sales, some people call it high velocity sales, and I'm just going to refer to it all as digital sales now. So if you hear that, just think to yourself, you could use those terms potentially interchangeably.
So I think that digital sales is such an important thing right now because as we went through the entire pandemic, a lot of things changed around us, right? The work culture changed, the way we approach sales has changed, the way we approach internal relationships have changed. So my first question, Frank, to you, what are some of the lessons that you have learned during COVID and what you would like to advise companies to continue with?
Yeah, it's such a great question. The way that I think about COVID is like a catalyst for change and transformation. And so if you had asked me pre-COVID, are teams moving more into a digital sales motion? I would have said absolutely, definitively. But the horizon is maybe like 10 years for companies to kind of get there. And then COVID-19 was this catalyst, this forcing function that kind of brought digital selling as a technique like really far to the future, or brought it from far in the future to here and now almost immediately. And a lot of companies didn't have this choice. We had to transform, we had to change, we had to adapt, because even if we wanted to rely on our historical techniques of in the field sales, face-to-face selling, or traditional sales technique, we couldn't, because we couldn't leave our homes or apartments. As we enter into this new era, some shifts that have happened as a result of that catalyst that I think are definitively here to stay are things like B2B buyer preferences. Now, having our buyers prefer to have more remote human interactions. They want us to sell to them now digitally or virtually, just in the same way we're talking right now over a virtual meeting. And the reality is that as the sales continues to progress, that the amount of face-to-face interactions are shrinking and shrinking, and the amount of digital interactions are increasing and increasing. And anecdotally, what I'm seeing is that across industries that historically have predominantly relied on face-to-face selling, and we're talking about very large enterprise companies, by the way, we're not, their table stakes was like, get in the field, roll the trucks, go shake a hand, are now like, we can't do it this way anymore because our buyers don't want us to do it that way. So I think one of the big catalysts is that we've seen B2B buyer preferences shift. And then we've seen companies start to react by focusing more on enabling digital selling motions in their organizations. So that's a big one.
One small question into this question would be, at what life cycle in the digital sales do you see a face-to-face interaction really make sense, or buyers are really looking forward to have a physical interaction? At what point?
That is a fantastic question. And there's a lot of data out there actually about this topic, but anecdotally, my perspective would be, if you think about just generalized sales stages, like say in the early stages, there's evaluation or maybe just research, and then there's product market fit assessment. I think it's happening more between kind of the top to middle of the funnel. And after you've had that face-to-face interaction in the top to middle of the funnel, then it's going from there. Definitively, I would say it's not in the top of the funnel. As a matter of fact, we've seen many enterprise companies who used to rely on these techniques of, let's drop in with a pizza unexpectedly or unannounced and have this conversation, or let's drop off a bottle of wine and meet and schmooze the gatekeeper or the secretary and try to get that handshake with somebody. We've seen, again, anecdotally, but people start to recoil from that as a hot flame. And they're like, why are you in my office? Just call me, or just set up a meeting and we'll talk over Zoom. And so it's definitely not at the top of the funnel. And I think it's definitely not in the middle of the funnel, but I think it's in those in-between stages. Then I think you could also make an argument that there's a case to say from middle of the funnel to bottom of the funnel that there's also potentially some times where face-to-face interactions may make sense, especially if something doesn't feel like it's moving. Inserting a face-to-face interaction or a workshop we've seen can help to progress a deal forward. And what we've been talking about here is like mostly on the customer acquisition side of things, right? Net new customer acquisition. On the customer expansion side, upsell, cross-sell, we're seeing a resurgence of companies that want to get face-to-face with their customers, especially if they have some tenure with those companies, particularly around the renewal period or even midway through the journey. And oftentimes we're seeing them under the guise of some other type of reason to meet, right? Let's have a workshop about what your roadmap looks like. And by the way, our sales rep's going to come along with us, right? To maintain the relationship. So it's more of a passive, I would say, sales interaction, if you will. And I don't think face-to-face sales interactions are dead, or I don't know if they'll ever fully go away, maybe sometime far in the future. It adds a trust component, but I also think it humanizes you. I'll tell you a quick story. I was working on this deal with a very large company and a multi-million-dollar deal, and the sales rep at Corporate Visions had sold this deal, closed it, and we never met our buyer face to face. We met them through Zoom, and all of our interactions happened digitally. And about 6 months into the project, we had this compelling reason to all get together, and it was for a workshop to continue progressing the development of our services. And during that time, our sales rep came along with us to attend those meetings. And we went out to dinner one of the nights, and I was sitting across from this SVP of sales, our champion, and we talked about his dog and his family and his kids going to college and what his retirement horizon looks like. In our very transactional Zoom meeting virtual world, you just don't get to that kind of stuff. And so from a relationship building standpoint, I still believe the validity of face-to-face interactions are absolutely there. And the trust that you can build with your buyer, or the shared experiences or the relationships that you can build face-to-face are really hard to replicate or duplicate in a virtual world.
Okay. So one final question on COVID. As sales have changed and digital sales, you explained it so well. We also see that the entire company culture has changed because it is a new way of working now. Call it hybrid. Some companies are forcing you to come, and it typically depends upon the role, in my opinion. What role you're playing, whether how much you should be in office or how much you should be interacting internally with your team versus how much external you can do. So tell me something about what you have seen in terms of how the company culture has changed and what is the future company culture going forward.
In all transparency, I think it's too soon to tell, honestly. But it's evolving really rapidly and really quickly. And here's some interesting stuff, right? So we're seeing a lot of enterprise companies adapt a kind of hybrid return to work policy. As an example, Monday, work from home. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you're in the office. Friday, work from home, right? So we're seeing this hybrid thing. And then we're seeing some companies that are being very forceful about it. And they're saying, no remote work. You got to be in the office because you're going to be more productive here. And then you see companies that are saying, let's give people the option. If they live near a hub or an office location, sure, you can come in if you want, but you don't have to. And so I think we're seeing all these varieties of things happen right now. And we're still waiting to see how that's all going to shake out. I saw this stat recently that was from an article in the Washington Post. And the source of the data was through LinkedIn job advertisements. And basically what this post was showing is that supply and demand for remote work right now is really not lining up. We're seeing this gigantic delta between the amount of people who are looking for remote positions and the amount of employers that are hiring for remote positions. So what's going to be really interesting is who gives in first? Is it the remote workforce that says, I'm sorry, but I'm just refused to go back into an office, so I'm just going to wait until I can find my remote job? Or is it the employers that are going to say, we need to rethink our post-COVID company culture in terms of remote work? It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. And then, of course, you have all these people who, through the pandemic, moved into, let's just call them rural parts of the country, or are outside of major hubs. They left San
Yes.
Francisco, they left New York City, they left some of these major hubs, which we've always considered to be the mecca of commerce. And as they left these hubs, now they're in Boise, Idaho, and they're looking for a job that's based in San Francisco. So are they going to have to move back into the city and return, or are they going to stay there? So I think it's too soon to tell overall culturally how remote work and hybrid work is going to unfold. But over the course of 2023, I think we're going to see some really interesting pieces of data continue to develop and come out as the market unfolds and as time unfolds.
So let me move on to a very different question, because what happened during COVID, everybody saw a big surge in technology. What have you seen? Which technologies have really helped companies transform into a true digital sales or true digital employee engagement? And what have your company done? Can you give us some examples on that?
Yeah, so I'm not going to name any vendors or
Yeah.
any technology companies. I want to try to remain Switzerland here if I can.
Okay.
If I think about it in three simple buckets, like people, process, and maybe products. If I think about it in those buckets, when I think about how have I seen people starting to leverage technology across those three cohorts, specifically as it relates to
People.
I think we're seeing a lot of focus around in organizations, anecdotally, around reducing cost. So saying, hey, we have 15 tools, 20 tools, 25 tools that we're asking a salesperson to interact with. First of all, do we need all these tools to begin with? Second of all, the tools that we do have, are people actually using them and adopting them? And is there an opportunity for us to consolidate or pare back our tech stack a bit to help us reduce cost? So that's, I think, a big one. And in terms of, let's just call it from the people side, I think we're also seeing things like this shift to a focus on less aggressive hiring pathways. And I don't want to get too cliche here, but I would say a huge trend that we're seeing is do more with less. We're not going to aggressively overhire. So from a people standpoint, we need to get the same output that we did last year or a greater output than we did last year with the existing employees that we have today, with a less aggressive hiring pathway. So again, not to get too cliche here, but I think there's a do more with less kind of theme that's definitely occurring, like increased productivity in order to do more with less, or efficiency, or some of those things. And I think that flows through too to some underlying trends, like how do we be more effective at headcount allocation? How are we more effective at onboarding and ramping people more quickly? This might be controversial, but from a people standpoint, I'm not totally sure how companies are thinking about employee churn. We've seen this massive trend of technology layoffs occurring. And so my theory is, or my thesis is, maybe they're not admitting it, but they're thinking slightly differently about employee churn. Okay, let's let organic attrition pare out some of the people in order to avoid a layoff situation. And I also think there's also this trend around people, and I'm getting a little off topic here, around quiet quitting in 2021. And even in parts of 2022, you could absolutely quiet quit and fly under the radar. I don't think you can quiet quit anymore. Because there's a lot of scrutiny around every person and what they're doing and what the efficacy of their role is. And so I think we'll see this quiet quitting trend start to diminish or be eliminated over time.
And that is a good thing. I'll tell you one simple thing of doing more with less. One company I was talking to, the VP of sales asked me a very simple question. Can you reduce my time that I spend with my salespeople to 15 minutes, to 5 minutes? Because if you can, then it gives them those 15 minutes back. And that is the real good productivity that they are going to use to deliver more. So definitely we are seeing that trend. So they were trying to reduce inefficiencies in the processes. They are trying to automate manual tasks. That's what companies are typically trying to do. And also trying to make sure it is no more one process fits all, because that's the kind of mega implementations we had seen, because everybody used to be in office and it never mattered. But now you're remote, it matters. Whether I'm doing upsell, cross-sell versus new customer, the process is very different. The steps I go through are very different.
Yeah, to your point, some interesting data points. So Forbes recently put out an article that says sales reps are spending less than 36% of their time actually selling. So that means they're spending the remaining amount doing non-selling activities. Don't quote me on this, but Forrester, I believe, put out a stat that says upwards of plus 70% of their time is spent not selling. It's spent doing updating CRM,
Yeah.
prospecting, doing things that are just non-core selling activities. And so productivity is absolutely this emerging trend that's happening. And it's a great opportunity as well for technology companies to step in where there's a realistic and attainable solution to help increase rep productivity. So I totally agree with you, and all the data out there today really supports what you're saying as well.
My next question is what's happening in the market today? Because we know inflation is real. How does a company optimize the cost? I would not call cut the cost. And why I use the word optimize is because how would they optimize a cost so that they don't hurt their long-term goal? Because if you're just transactional, saying that I just need to reduce the cost by 30% and that's going to impact my growth for next 2 years, then actually you have not done a good job. As a CXO, how are companies really doing that? What is your observation into this space?
I think we've talked about some of it already. A lot of it is what I would refer to as this concept of the action trap. What we start to do is we start to say, let's take a fine-tooth comb and look through all of our spend areas today. From a cut cost perspective, what are our spend areas? And I'm going to put people aside for a second, but what are we spending on technology? What are we spending on vendors? What are we spending on some of these auxiliary things in our organization? And are we really utilizing those things in a way that is supporting our bottom line? So I think a big part of it first is scrutiny and taking a lot of immediate action. And then I think what's happening, I'll call it an action trap perspective, is we're also starting to scrutinize our sales teams really heavily. We're starting to focus on activity and performance and pipeline reviews and deal reviews. And we're like just really tightening around our sales reps and our sales team. That's not necessarily a cut cost, but it's what we do when we feel like we're losing control of something, we really want to take an action. And the reason I call it an action trap is because oftentimes that scrutiny actually results in more time spent not selling. We just talked about this lack of selling activities, and that is forcing our reps even farther away from productivity. And also, just to humanize this for a moment, our salespeople in 2021 were our heroes. They brought us through, sold their butts off. And even maybe pre-2021, these people that had long tenure that had been with our organization. And now with the action traps that are popping up all over organizations, we're almost like punishing our heroes. Our heroes of yesterday are the villains of today. And we're saying, well, here's another spreadsheet to fill out. Here's another thing I want you to enter into CRM. Here's another pipeline review call. Here's this list of arbitrary boxes you need to check for your next QBR. I think we're constricting and we're tightening around our sales organization. And I think we need to shift away from the action trap and being forceful and constraining our sales teams and our sales organizations. And we need to shift to more of an enablement motion. Do these people have the right skills to be effective in the market? Have we enabled and equipped them with the right messaging in a changing market so that in that right moment, they can nail that moment? We've over-rotated too far in that way, and it's unclear on what the ramifications of that might be. The other thing that I think we're really seeing is so much uncertainty. It is like we're standing at a crossroads, and we've been standing at this crossroads for a really long time. And we're all saying to ourselves, are we in a recession? Are we not? Are we in an economic downturn? Are we not? Like, why is unemployment so low, but the market is so bad? And so I think there's been this paralysis analysis that's happening in organizations where they're unwilling to make decisions right now because there is not a clear direction of what's happening in the market. And so when they're faced with this indecision and this paralysis analysis, because they're not sure, there's uncertainty, they make no decision at all. They say, just wait and see how this plays out before we're willing to put our eggs in any basket. So I think that's another really big trend that we're starting to see. Again, a lot of this just anecdotally, but still interesting nonetheless.
One last question I have for you is, what advice would you give to the CXOs into your space on going forward with digital sales happening, workspace changing, at the same time we are seeing the downturn and inflation cropping in?
So that's a great question. It's such a broad question too, because there's all kinds of advice. I think broadly speaking, technology is your friend, especially sales technology is your friend. At a topical level, when we're thinking about reducing cost, we're thinking about what do we have in excess? And usually that's our first place that we think about making a cut or a trim. And looking at something at a topical level from a technological standpoint means less about, are we spending money on something that we're not receiving the output on? Yes or no? Is there actually opportunity here to cure? Did I actually purchase this technology with a good intention of accomplishing X? And is it actually not being adopted because of Y? And so in the circumstance, before we just start cutting left and right, which is the ultimate temptation, it's just taking a brief moment to pause and say, what was the genesis of the reason why we made this investment to begin with? And have we not seen the results of this investment? And then quickly trying to diagnose why, whether or not that tool still fits in your tool stack or that investment or purchase still fits in your bag of tricks. And then if you don't check the box on those, then yeah, go forward and make the cuts. But first, check the box on a couple of those things before you just hit the bottom line and start cutting left and right. And sometimes that's not possible in like very hierarchical and organizations where there's a lot of layers between somebody making that decision and the person at the end user or the person that it really affects. Another piece of advice I would give people is to try to avoid the action trap. The temptation as leaders and the temptation as an executive is to put things under a higher degree of scrutiny, to maybe even if I'm an executive, I join pipeline review calls. And last year, I may not have joined a single pipeline review call because I refreshed my dashboard and everything looks good. The inverse of the action trap, or the alternative to the action trap, is just taking a thoughtful and smart approach. Like higher degrees of scrutiny is the temptation, and there's a place for that, but not at the expense of our sales rep or not at the expense of our sales organization. And so really finding that balance between what is the right degree of scrutiny versus also continuing to support our sales organization through a time where there feels like there's a lot of uncertainty, not just at a corporate level, but at an individual level as well.
Yeah, you said it very rightly. Getting some technology help to avoid the action trap if you have good dashboards. If they are giving something back to salespeople as well as to management, then there is an adoption. Saying that I don't need to get on a 30-minute call or 1 hour call where I get 5 minutes to talk. Instead of that, I think my boss is going to call me about a specific deal. So it's going to be a leading conversation rather than just a passive update. Technology can significantly help there. So you said it very rightly. Thank you so much. It was a great advice. Anything else you have to say?
I could talk about this all day long.
Absolutely. I see your passion.
I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciated this opportunity. I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation alive.
Thank you so much.